Welcome back, everyone. For this deep dive, we're going to uncover the secretive world of commodity trading.
Yeah, it's a world that most people don't think about.
Right, but one that touches everything.
Touches every single thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're going deep into the book World for Sale by Javier, Blas and Farchy
Excellent book.
to learn just how these traders became so powerful.
Yeah, and how they what kind of tactics did they use, and
Right.
what does it all mean for us
And what it means for us today.
today?
This is a story that actually starts with a huge power shift.
Absolutely.
For decades, the oil market was controlled by just a handful of companies
Yeah.
called the Seven Sisters.
It was like a private club.
Yeah, it was like a global oil monopoly.
Pretty much they dictated everything. The prices, the terms, you name it.
Wow. Not very fair.
Not really.
But then in the 1970s, things started to change.
Yeah.
We saw the rise of resource nationalism,
Yeah.
where countries wanted control of their own resources.
Mm-hmm. They were tired of these multinational corporations coming in and
Right.
taking all the profits.
And they wanted a bigger piece of the pie for themselves.
Exactly, and that led to a lot of pushback.
Yeah.
A lot of nationalizations.
Yeah, and the Seven Sisters' power began to crumble.
It really shook things up.
What I find so interesting is that even the CIA was tracking the rise of these traders back in 1968.
Yeah, they saw it coming.
They must have known something big was about to happen.
They did. It was a real turning point.
And with the Seven Sisters losing their grip on the market,
Yeah.
it created an opening for a new type of trader to emerge.
Independent traders.
Yeah, who could operate in this new world.
Right, where access to resources wasn't just a given anymore.
It wasn't just about understanding the markets anymore.
Oh,
It was about building relationships and making deals in a world where the rules were changing.
exactly. And there were a few key figures who really led the way.
Like who?
Well, there's this guy, Theodor Weiser, a German trader, and he had the audacity to buy oil directly from the Soviet Union.
Wow, going straight to the source.
Yeah.
I bet that ruffled some feathers.
Oh, it absolutely did.
I mean, this was unheard of at the time.
It was a direct challenge to the Seven Sisters.
So what happened?
Well, they tried to punish him, you know.
Really?
They blackballed him from the industry.
Wow.
Refused to do business with him.
So it was a pretty cutthroat world.
Oh, incredibly cutthroat. Yeah.
But I guess Weisser's move showed that there were huge profits to be made.
Huge, if you were willing to break the rules.
So it was about more than just business.
Yeah.
It was about power.
Absolutely.
And about who controlled the resources.
Resources that fuel the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Weisser wasn't the only one shaking things up, right?
No, not at all.
Who else was there?
Well, there's Ludwig Jesselson.
Okay.
He was a brilliant guy, a real master negotiator.
What did he do?
He led the company Philip Brothers and turned them into a major force in the metals market.
So he was taking on the big players.
Oh, yeah, he wasn't afraid of anyone, not even Wall Street.
And then there was Cargill Macmillan.
Right, the heir to the Cargill fortune.
So he was already coming from a position of power.
He was, but he had his own ambitions.
What did he do?
He expanded Cargill's grain trading empire globally.
Globally.
Yeah, he was even trading behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War.
That's incredible.
That was a different time.
So we've got a German trader challenging the status quo, a Wall Street maverick,
Yeah.
and an American venturing into the heart of the Soviet Empire.
It's an interesting mix.
What did these early pioneers have in common?
Well, they all had this international mindset.
Okay.
They were willing to take risks, calculated risks, of course.
Right.
And maybe most importantly, they were all incredibly good at building relationships.
Because access to resources was becoming less about corporate agreements and more about personal connections.
Exactly. You had to know the right people, understand their culture,
Yeah.
and be able to navigate complex political situations.
So the world of commodity trading was becoming less about boardrooms
Yeah,
and more about understanding the nuances of global power.
that's a great way to put it.
And perhaps no one embodied that shift better than Mark Rich,
Mark
the so-called godfather of oil trading.
He was a legend, a true giant of the industry.
His story is fascinating. He started at the very bottom in the mailroom at Philip Brothers.
Yeah, he worked his way up.
Through sheer talent and ambition.
He was relentless.
But he wasn't content with the traditional way of doing business.
No, he saw the cracks in the system.
And he exploited them.
Brilliantly.
The book describes how he mastered the use of letters of credit to finance these massive trades.
Yeah, he was a financial wizard.
With minimal capital.
He knew how to leverage every resource.
And he wasn't afraid to take risks,
No, not at all.
especially in volatile geopolitical situations.
Like the Eilat-Ashkelon pipeline deal.
That was a complicated arrangement.
Very complicated. It involved Israel, Iran, oil, all sorts of things.
That sounds like a diplomatic nightmare.
It was, but Rich thrived in those kinds of situations.
He didn't let politics get in the way of profit.
No, he was willing to deal with anyone, regardless of their ideology.
And of course, there's the infamous deal with Iran during the U.S. hostage crisis.
Oh, yeah, that one landed him in hot water.
It put him on the FBI's most wanted list.
That's right.
It really shows the inherent tension in commodity trading.
Yeah.
The pursuit of profit often clashes with ethical considerations.
And geopolitical realities.
And Rich's story perfectly captures that tension.
He made a fortune during the oil price shocks of the 1970s.
That was a crazy time.
It was a lot of volatility.
But his empire eventually crumbled under the weight of legal troubles.
Tax evasion, trading with the enemy.
He ended up fleeing the U.S.
And living in exile for years.
until he received a presidential pardon.
Which was very controversial.
That's a whole other story.
It is.
But for now, let's focus on what happened after Rich's empire collapsed.
Okay.
Because a vacuum like that doesn't stay empty for long.
You're absolutely right about that.
Who stepped in to fill the void?
Well, some of them were people who had learned from Rich himself.
Oh, really?
His company's collapse actually gave rise to a new generation of trading giants.
Like who?
Well, there was Glencore.
Oh.
They were founded by a group of former rich traders.
So they knew the game?
They did, and they were ambitious.
And they were led by Ivan Glassenberg.
Yeah, a very driven guy.
What were they known for?
Aggressive deal-making, operating in tough environments.
So they weren't afraid to get their hands dirty.
Not at all.
And then there was Trafigura.
Yes, Trafigura.
Also founded by former rich associates.
That's right.
What was their specialty?
Oil trading.
Oil, the lifeblood of the global economy.
Exactly.
What were they like?
They had a reputation for taking risks.
Oh,
Pushing the boundaries.
and weren't afraid of controversy.
No, not at all.
So it seems Rich's legacy lived on.
In a way, yes.
Fractured and amplified through these new companies.
They took his playbook and ran with it.
And they were operating in a world that was rapidly changing.
It was.
The collapse of the Soviet Union, for example, presented a huge opportunity.
A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
All these vast reserves of oil, metals, agricultural
It
commodities,
was like a new frontier opening up.
and the regulatory environment in these newly independent states.
It was pretty Wild West.
So it was a chaotic time
It was, but incredibly lucrative.
for those who knew how to play the game,
Exactly.
like the Rubin brothers.
Yes, the Rubins.
What did they do?
They made a fortune in the aluminum market.
In the former Soviet Union.
Yeah, they knew how to navigate that world.
And Glencore was right there in the thick of it, too.
Oh, absolutely.
What were they up to?
All sorts of deals across the former Soviet bloc.
Give me an example.
Well, their oil supply arrangements with Romania were pretty controversial.
What happened?
They were accused of exploiting the weak regulations.
To line their own pockets.
Essentially, yes.
So it was a Wild West scenario.
Very much so.
Fortunes being made. Ethical boundaries being tested.
Definitely.
But then as the world entered the 21st century, a new force emerged that would change everything.
China.
China. The sleeping giant awakens,
And their economy exploded.
creating this massive demand for raw materials.
Everything from oil and copper to iron ore and soybeans.
Prices skyrocketed.
It was the commodity supercycle.
And the traders who saw it coming made a killing.
They did, and Glencore was one of them.
They were early to recognize the potential of the China boom.
They were, and they positioned themselves perfectly.
But their actions during this period also drew criticism.
Yeah, there were some questionable deals.
Like what?
Well, during the Russian wheat crisis of 2010, Glencore was accused of making the situation worse.
How so?
Their aggressive trading practices contributed to food shortages
Wow.
and price spikes in vulnerable regions.
So their pursuit of profit had real-world consequences.
It did, and it raised some serious ethical questions.
Because we're not just talking about abstract financial transactions anymore. We're talking about essential commodities like food.
The things that people need to survive.
And it shows the power these traders have.
They can impact the lives of millions.
It wasn't just the China boom that fueled these massive profits.
Right.
The book also talks about how these traders were masters of exploiting market volatility. and using these complex financial instruments.
Like optionality.
Functionality.
Yeah, it basically gives the trader a choice.
A choice.
Yeah, like let's say they buy a huge amount of oil
Right.
with the option to sell it at a certain price
Right.
within a certain time frame.
Okay.
If the price goes up, they exercise their option and sell at a profit.
Makes sense.
But if the price goes down, they can choose not to sell.
So they limit their losses
Exactly. It's all about managing risk.
while maximizing profit.
It's a high-stakes game.
And these traders were the masters.
They were.
But all this financial muscle, all this influence, it had to translate into political power.
Oh, absolutely.
They became power brokers in many resource-rich countries
They were the lenders of last resort.
for governments desperate for cash
Exactly. And they used that leverage to secure favorable deals.
and access to valuable resources.
It was a win-win for them.
Can you give me some examples?
Sure. Glencore, for example, financed a big chunk of Chad's oil sector.
Okay.
And in return, they got preferential access to their crude reserves.
Go there.
Vitol provided massive loans to Kazakhstan's state-owned oil company.
So they became a key player in their energy sector.
Exactly.
And then there's the story of how traders bankrolled the Kurdish independence movement.
Now that's a fascinating one.
They were funding a separatist movement,
They were. It was a risky gamble.
but potentially very lucrative.
It had paid off.
The book even mentions that Kurdish oil was secretly shipped through Israel.
It sounds like something out of a spy novel.
It does. It's like a whole other world,
It is. A world where the rules are different.
where traditional alliances and geopolitical norms don't always apply.
And where the pursuit of profit can lead to some very strange bedfellows.
But this era of unchecked power couldn't last forever.
Right. No, it couldn't.
At some point, the world had to start paying attention.
They did, and the reckoning was coming.
What were the cracks in their armor?
Well, we'll have to save that for after the break.
Stay tuned, folks. We'll be back in a moment to continue our deep dive into the world of commodity trading.
It's going to get interesting.
Welcome back to the show. During the break, we were talking about how the world was starting to pay attention to the immense power these commodity traders were wielding.
Yes, they were operating in the shadows for a long time, but things were about to change.
So how did the reckoning begin? What were the first signs that the tide was turning against these traders?
Well, the U.S. Department of Justice started cracking down on corruption, especially in industries that dealt with countries under U.S. sanctions.
So the legal landscape was shifting.
It was. And a lot of these traders, they'd been operating in these gray areas for years. They had to adapt or face the consequences.
Can you give us a specific example of this crackdown, a case that really sent shockwaves through the industry?
Oh, absolutely. The case involving BNP Paribas, a huge French bank.
What happened there?
Well, they were found guilty of violating U.S. sanctions against Sudan, Iran, and Cuba.
Those are some serious accusations.
They were. And the fine was massive, almost $9 billion.
$9 billion. Wow, that's a staggering amount.
It was a wake-up call for the entire industry.
I bet it was. So it wasn't just about making deals anymore. They had to start thinking about the legal ramifications.
Exactly. Compliance departments were suddenly very important, and companies had to be more careful about who they did business with.
So even these giants, they weren't immune to the law.
No, not at all. And remember Claude Dauphin, the head of Trafigura.
Yeah, the one who wasn't afraid of risky ventures.
Well, BNP Paribas was their main bank.
Oh, no.
They barely survived the fallout from that case.
So even the most powerful players in the industry, they could be brought down.
It showed that the rules were changing, that the era of unchecked power was coming to an end.
But it wasn't just governments cracking down, was it? The public was also becoming more aware of what was going on.
You're right. People started asking questions about where their resources came from and the impact these traders were having on the world.
And there were some scandals, right? Some high-profile cases that really exposed the darker side of the industry.
Yes, there were. The Probo Koala incident, for example.
Refresh my memory. What was that about?
It involved Trafigura and the dumping of toxic waste in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire.
That sounds awful.
It was. It caused a huge public outcry, legal battles, and really highlighted the human and environmental cost of some of these operations.
So the industry's reputation was taking a hit.
It was. They couldn't just operate in the shadows anymore. They had to start thinking about public perception.
So how did they respond to all this pressure?
Well, they had to adapt, of course. Some tried to go mainstream, like Glencore. They launched an IPO and became a publicly traded company.
So they were opening themselves up to more scrutiny.
They were, in theory at least. It was a way to try to improve their image and show that they were willing to be more transparent.
But others, like Vital and Trafigura, they stayed private.
They did, but they still had to be more careful, more strategic. The Wild West days were over.
So the landscape was shifting, both legally and in terms of public perception.
It was. And while the established players were trying to adapt, a new breed of competitor was emerging.
Who were they?
The Chinese. Companies like Zhuhai Zhenrong.
Oh, China. Their economy was beaming, they needed resources, and they were ready to play the game.
Exactly. And they weren't afraid to go after deals in those riskier, more politically complex markets that Western traders had traditionally dominated.
So the competition was heating up.
It was. And then came another major disruption, the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right, 2020, the world shut down.
Yeah.
How did that impact commodity trading?
Well, it caused massive volatility in the markets. Some sectors, like oil, completely crashed as demand plummeted.
So it was a time of great uncertainty.
It was. But some traders, true to form, saw opportunity in the chaos. Glencore, for example, pulled off a massive oil storage play.
What do you mean by that?
They basically bought a huge amount of oil at low prices, stored it, and waited for the market to rebound.
So they bet on the fact that the world would eventually need oil again.
They did, and it paid off big time.
It seems like these guys are always one step ahead.
Mm.
So where does that leave the industry today? What does the future hold for commodity trading?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? The world is changing, globalization is declining, trade wars are on the rise, and we have the looming threat of climate change.
It's a lot to grapple with.
It is, and the era of unchecked power is definitely over. These companies are facing increasing pressure to be more transparent, more accountable.
So they can't just operate in the shadows anymore.
No, they can't. Consumers are demanding ethical sourcing, investors are factoring in environmental and social risks, and governments are tightening regulations.
It sounds like the industry is at a crossroads.
It is. They have to adapt or risk becoming obsolete. Some are trying to diversify, investing in renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, even carbon offsets.
So they're trying to present a greener image.
They are. But whether these efforts are genuine or just greenwashing, that remains to be seen.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers. And as we've seen throughout this deep dive, the world of commodity trading is intertwined with so many other factors. Geopolitics, economics, the environment, the very resources that sustain our planet.
Absolutely. The decisions these traders make have a profound impact on all of us. And as we move forward, we need to keep asking the tough questions.
Like what?
Like, will these companies be part of the solution to the challenges we face, or will they continue to prioritize profit over everything else?
That's a question we all need to consider. It's been a fascinating journey, exploring the rise and reign of these commodity traders, their impact on the world, and the uncertain future they now face.
It's been a pleasure diving into this with you.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you a glimpse into this complex and often hidden world. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those tough questions. Welcome back to the show. So before the break, we were discussing how these commodity traders were facing a reckoning.
Yeah, the world was catching up to them.
Right, they couldn't operate with impunity anymore.
Exactly.
So where did these cracks start appearing?
Well, the U.S. Department of Justice started cracking down on corruption,
Okay,
especially targeting companies involved in sanctions violations.
that makes sense.
I mean, a lot of these traders had
Yeah.
been working in countries with
Yeah.
regimes under U.S. sanctions.
So they're really starting to feel the heat.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Do you have an example of a case that really shook things up?
Yeah, the BNP Paribas case.
What was that one?
So BNP Paribas, this huge French bank,
Okay.
they got caught violating U.S. sanctions against Sudan, Iran, and Cuba.
Right.
And they were hit with a massive fine, like almost $9 billion.
$9 billion. That's insane.
Yeah, it was a huge wake-up call for the whole industry.
Like, you can't just ignore the law.
No, not anymore.
It's interesting because you mentioned before that Claude Dauphin and Trafigura,
Yeah.
they survived by the skin of their teeth when BNP Paribas.
Oh, yeah, they got in trouble.
BNP Paribas was their main bank.
So even the giants weren't invincible?
Nope, they were vulnerable too.
So it wasn't just the legal landscape changing.
Right.
The public was getting more aware of the industry's practices, too.
Yeah, definitely people started asking questions.
Like, where are our resources coming from?
Yeah, and what's the impact of all this trading?
Right, exactly. And there were some pretty big scandals that brought these issues to light.
Like the Probo Koala incident?
Oh, right. What was that one again?
It involved Trafigura
Okay.
and the dumping of toxic waste in Côte d'Ivoire.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah, it was a huge environmental disaster.
And it caused a lot of outrage,
It did, and it really damaged the industry's reputation.
so they couldn't hide anymore.
Nope, the spotlight was on them.
Yeah.
So how did these commodity traders respond?
Well, they had to adapt.
Like, what did they do?
Some tried to go mainstream.
Interesting.
Like Glencore, they launched an IPO and became a publicly traded company.
So they were trying to show they were more transparent.
Yeah, and accountable to shareholders.
But others stayed private.
Yeah, like Vital and Trafigura.
But they still had to be more careful.
Definitely. The Wild West days were over.
So the landscape was shifting, the old way of doing business wasn't working anymore.
That's right.
And while all this was happening, a new breed of competitor was emerging.
The Chinese.
The Chinese, yeah, we talked about their growing demand for resources.
Right, but they were also becoming major players in the trading game themselves.
So companies like Zhuhai Zhenrong,
Exactly.
they were going after deals in those riskier markets.
Yeah, the ones that Western traders had dominated for so long.
So the competition was getting fierce.
It was.
And then on top of all that, the world gets hit with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, 2020, what a year.
How did that impact the commodity markets?
Well, it caused chaos, huge volatility.
I can imagine.
Some sectors crashed, like oil, demand just plummeted.
It was a tough time for everyone.
It was, but some traders actually saw it as an opportunity.
Really?
Yeah, like Glencore, they made a huge bet on oil storage.
What does that mean?
They bought a ton of oil when prices were low,
Okay.
stored it, and waited for the market to rebound.
And it worked.
It did. They made a killing.
So even in a global crisis, they found a way to profit.
They're survivors, that's for sure.
So where does that leave us today? What's the future of commodity trading?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it?
It is. It's a different world now.
It is. We've got the decline of globalization, trade wars, climate change,
A lot of uncertainty.
a lot of challenges.
So can these companies adapt?
Some are trying.
How so?
They're investing in renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, things like that.
So they're trying to green their image.
Yeah, but whether it's genuine or just greenwashing, that's hard to say.
It's a complex issue. It is. But one thing's for sure.
What's that?
The era of unchecked power is over.
Yeah, they're under scrutiny now.
From governments, from the public, from
They
investors,
can't just operate in the shadows anymore.
they have to be more accountable.
Exactly.
And I think that's a good thing.
I agree.
This deep dive has been fascinating, really eye-opening.
It's a complex world, that's for sure.
It is, but it's one that impacts all of us.
It does, whether we realize it or not.
And I think it's important for us to understand how it works.
Definitely, knowledge is power.
And the more we know about this industry, the better equipped we are to hold these traders accountable.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking.
It's been a pleasure.
And we encourage you to keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep demanding a more just and sustainable world.
We all have a role to play.
That's right. Until next time, thanks for listening.